Hey, welcome back to Zombie Tactics. Today, second part of a three-part series having to do with a particular argument that comes up when we're talking about the Second Amendment and how it applies to us today. I dealt in the first part about the basic logic of this idea, the idea that people put forth that somehow the Founding Fathers didn't intend or they never imagined that we could have had the kinds of firearms today that you can shoot, say, more than 10 times without reloading them, and that somehow this is a horrible thing and that the Second Amendment shouldn't apply to us today because of this. Now, I dealt with the basic logic and intellectual integrity behind that kind of an idea, or the lack of it, in the first video, and I encourage you to watch that one. If you don't, this video is about something a little bit more narrow. And what I want to talk about specifically is whether they intended or could have imagined that we would actually have firearms equal to what the military has. It's an interesting question, and one of the things I want to point out from the get-go is that we are already at a point where, as citizens, we don't have that. So it's kind of a disingenuous question. The people that ask it, I think they've kind of got it in their heads that that's what we really want when we want to have something like a citizen model of an AR-15 or something like a Remington R1 that's clearly a hunting rifle, but what would fall under their definition of what they call an assault weapon. This gets fuzzied up a lot, and I think people don't realize that when I'm holding an AR-15 in my hand, I am not holding a military weapon. I am holding something that is a civilian version of it that does not have the same capabilities. So what we're already talking about is just holding on to stuff that doesn't have the same capabilities as what the military has. So in some sense, whether or not the founders intended this, that, or the other thing, the question itself doesn't make sense on its face because it's already been answered in a sense. As a practical sense, we as citizens don't have that kind of stuff. Nor do we have Predator drones, nor do we have F-16 fighter jets or aircraft carriers or nuclear weapons. I mean, come on, let's be honest and let's have some intellectual integrity about the nature of that kind of a question and our discussion of the Second Amendment. But the question still comes up. I just thought I wanted to point that out in passing because we're already at a point where the question in a way doesn't make sense. But people will say, well, they never intended for you to have things that were equal to what the military has. And I want to talk about why I think it doesn't make sense to say that, just from the history of the time. And we're talking about this narrow question about the military versus the citizenry. Keep in mind that at the time, the infantry of both the American forces and the British forces used a smooth-bore musket as their long gun. What we might think of as being a rifle, but it really isn't because it's a smooth-bore firearm. It's actually much closer to a shotgun than it is to any modern hunting rifle or anything like that. And that's what the British forces had at the time. And people will say, well, see, that's what they were thinking about. That's the only thing they could have thought about. And so that's all it's supposed to mean. Well, of course, we also know that people had flintlock pistols, so maybe it ought to cover that too. But that's kind of what they've got in mind when they say that. The problem is it's not historically accurate. And the historical record will give us a clue to what the actual meaning of the Second Amendment is. At the time of the Revolutionary War, as I said, both sides had these smooth-bore muskets as the primary arm of their infantrymen. The British also had another thing going for them, though, and that is that they had a fairly well-equipped artillery consisting of various sizes of cannon, some of which, although they didn't have many of them, could fire cannonballs of various kinds up to 800 yards, and this put our forces at a tremendous tactical advantage. Now, of course, we wanted to have cannons too. There was a problem behind that, though. We barely had enough money to get muskets to these guys. We didn't, in a lot of cases, have enough money to get uniforms or boots or anything like that kind of thing to the troops that wanted them. And you can look that up in the historical record. Washington was begging for money to get his troops boots, some of whom were walking around with bare feet that were infected and all kinds of stuff. So we didn't have money for cannons. Where did we get the few cannons that we had? We got them from people who owned them, ordinary citizens who owned cannons, because ordinary citizens, even under British law, before hostilities started, were able to own cannon. So just as a data point here, it kind of sounds like it's silly to say that we shouldn't be able to own military-grade weapons or military weapons equal to what the government has, when even the British didn't deny us that right right up until the time that hostilities started. And of course, at that time, they wanted to start confiscating all weapons and cannons and everything. But even under British law in the colonies, you could own any doggone firearm you wanted, including cannons and things that were in some cases arguably better than what the military had. Another one of these things that bears into this tactical advantage of the British having a lot of cannon and we having hardly any that we got from citizens, is that Washington discovered something called the Kentucky Riflemen. Now, I don't know if they were actually called Kentucky Riflemen at the time or not, but they were called that because they had something in their possession called Kentucky rifles. And again, I don't know if that term is anachronistic. That's what we call it now. And these rifles were different than muskets in an important way. They were able to fire accurately out to about 300 yards. Another part was important about that, and that was that they were kind of hard to load, but the people that had them made up for that because they had, like in many cases, 2 or 3 of them, or 5 or 6 of them, or even more of them in their possession. So in other words, the people already had, these guys had, individually at least, they had more guns than what a soldier would have. And those guns were more accurate, and they were able to fire out further distances than what they had. So again, citizens had things that were superior to what the military had, and they were in their possession. What Washington did is he came along and he actually recruited these Kentucky Riflemen and said, hey, you guys, I got an idea for you. I'm going to put you out at the flanks, and what I want you to do is I want you to shoot the guys with the cannons. And since our troops, ordinary troops, only had a range of 50 to 100 yards, and these Kentucky Riflemen had a range of 300 yards, they started picking off the guys that were operating the artillery, and they started picking off officers, and this was pivotal in many cases in our Revolutionary War. Matter of fact, it was such an interesting thing that happened that the Brits found out about these Kentucky Riflemen. Most of them were not dressed like regular troops. They were dressed like, kind of like what Daniel Boone, think of that. And they said, start looking out for these guys, they're dangerous. Washington, on the other side, found out that the Brits found out about it, and what he did is he started dressing up parts of his troops that didn't even have the Kentucky rifle in buckskin and coon caps, and it freaked out the British. There were actually a few battles where the British came up against forces that had a significant number of people in these buckskin outfits. They thought they were all Kentucky Riflemen, and they said, holy crap, we're out of here. And this ended up being decisive in many battles in the war, or at least a few of them. So the idea, historically, that the Second Amendment is supposed to tell us that we can't have things that the military has when we just finished winning our war for independence using stuff that the citizens have that was superior to what our own military or their military had, doesn't hold weight intellectually, it doesn't hold weight historically, and it's kind of a silly way to look at the Second Amendment. The idea just plain doesn't make sense. I'll be back with part 3 of this, talking about whether or not the Founding Fathers imagined we would have the kinds of weapons that we have today or not. That's going to be another interesting, and I think it'll put this whole line of reasoning to bed. That's Zombie Tactics for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.